Hello, hello. Today we are turning to one of, I think, the most widely interesting topics in political science. Of course, that's a tough phrase. So much interesting stuff. And we're going to be looking at international relations. We're sort of leveling up. We've been talking about basically politics at the domestic level, or whether we're talking about politics at the domestic level in the United States or in Japan or in Germany or wherever. We've been dealing with situations within states. And now we are going to turn to international relations, which is a huge part of political science. And instead of looking within states like we've been looking, this is the politics of states sort of getting along together or not getting along together. So this is politics between or among states. So Shively defines international relations as sort of any decision where you're making collective choices for a group of two or more states. So we talked about what politics means and what the politics and political science would be. And of course, that political is the public use of binding authority. And when we turn to international relations, instead of asking questions like how should that power be used and how is that power used and to what effect is that power used at the domestic level, for example, with something like reforming the healthcare system or determining the level of regulation of an industry or determining tax rates or building a constitution and picking out different institutions, right? These are all domestic issues that we've been wrestling with. Now we're going to look at, well, what happens when lots of different states are trying to solve a problem together or come into conflict? How does power work at that level? And so if I were to ask you a question like, will China democratize? We're still talking about something going on within the country or the state of China. However, to ask an international relations question, we would say something like, will China's rising military and economic strength make it more aggressive towards the United States? Or will United States aid to civil society and pro-democracy organizations within China lead to domestic political change in China? And so you can see the distinction both between domestic politics and politics between states or international relations, but also how these things bleed together. A lot of the questions we ask about in domestic politics are going to be influenced by international politics and of course vice versa. And so what we're going to do with our time together as we talk about international relations is just go over some of the most basic concepts because this is, as I've mentioned, is so often the case in our 101 class together. This is a huge, huge, huge topic. But there are a few sort of key concepts that really sit at the heart of international relations and distinguish it from the study of other forms of politics. Likewise, we're also going to see that some of our old friends, ideas about state scope, ideas about building institutions and norms, and especially ideas about collective action problems and free riders and things like that, we're going to see that those matter a lot on the international stage as well. So we're going to meet a few new concepts, but actually a lot of the things that we've talked about are going to reappear here. And the first thing that's going to reappear and take on a much more important role for us as we study international relations is anarchy. And anarchy is basically a lack of a central authority. And if you think back to this image that I have here, of course, we've seen this before. This is the book cover of Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, right? And the idea is that Hobbes gave us is that people are going to get out of that state of nature where life is nasty, brutish, and short, and they are going to give up some of their freedom to a Leviathan, this monster, this central authority, or the state, right? And of course, for Hobbes, that's the king, and here's the king, and we can remember that his power is actually made of the power of his citizens or subjects, right? And what this does is that it allows for a central authority to make policy to overcome all sorts of problems. Well, international relations is going to be very, very concerned with anarchy because on the global stage, there is no one central authority. There's no Leviathan that runs the entire world. So if you're in the United States, the U.S. federal government, that broad country level state government, that's our Leviathan. If I do something wrong, the U.S. federal government is going to be able to use coercion and persuasion in order to change my behavior. Now, level up to the international level. Well, if one state does something wrong, who is there to push back? Who is there to enforce laws? There are certainly lots of institutions, and we're going to talk about those, but they do not have the same publicly binding authority that we talk about the state having. So at the international level, we don't have a strong central authority necessarily. And a lot of what we talk about in international relations is going to be ways to think about dealing with anarchy. How do we solve problems? How do we come to conclusions and conflicts when we do not have a central authority that's actually able to enact with real teeth, with real power, a lot of what we might agree upon or even disagree upon? And so if we think about overcoming problems at a domestic level, you can think about you can deal with state scope, or you can expand state scope in order to provide public goods, for example, to try and overcome market failures like externalities. Or perhaps state scope is the problem that there's too much state regulation or interference in market mechanisms. So you can talk about solving problems at domestic levels by really changing the scope of the state. But at the international level, what does that mean? I mean, so we have anarchy. We don't have an international state. We don't have an international Leviathan. And so in solving international relations problems, we have to think about different actors, and these are our states, the United States versus France versus Russia versus China versus North Korea, right? All of these different states are players, and we have to think about what are they going to do, how are we going to deal with them, and how are we going to deal with them given that we are in a state of anarchy. So sometimes the way I like to think about international relations is the old game Risk. And of course, this is the game where you play different countries and you're trying to sort of take over the world. And it's not necessarily the case that we are thinking of states as always out to get one another, although we're going to review different theories of international relations to try and understand when that might actually be the case and when it's not. But this is sort of the way to think about the distinction. International relations is really a lot about war and peace, about treaties, about agreements among states, about problems that are too big for any one state to handle, these transnational issues that we'll talk about. But studying states and is a little bit different than studying other levels of politics. And so how do we study states as sort of the main character? You know, when we study the state, if we're talking about healthcare reform or gun legislation or issues of civil rights, we are really studying individual actors a lot of the time. So we might talk about the people that comprise, the Senate Committee on Healthcare, or the president and the administration and the cabinet, right? And we're talking about we're talking about voters. So we're talking about lots of different actors within the state using their power and using their persuasion, to try and change things within the state. So that's how we work at the domestic level. At the international level, instead of lots of actors trying to influence the state and the policies of the state, now what we're really doing is talking about the state as the actor. And it's hard to know exactly how to think about that. So some international relations scholars are going to talk about states almost as if they're people. The United States did this and that made China angry, and so China reacted in that way. Not that anybody actually literally feels that China feels emotions like anger, but that a lot of the time there will be this drive to treat states as unitary actors. On the other hand, we know that states are comprised of lots of different people and power centers and actors that are often in conflict with one another. And so it can often be really difficult to understand exactly how we can predict states' behaviors and understand the ways in which we can influence other states to try and work with them or solve problems with them, or if you're going to be a hardcore realist, beat them at this international game of Risk. So in conclusion of this introduction to international relations, we're going to return to one more of our favorite old concepts, and that's the idea of sovereignty. And sovereignty is really the main norm and organizing principle of international relations, or I keep saying international relations, IR, international relations is the abbreviation that I'm going to use. So sovereignty, basically, of course, we've studied it as the idea, as Max Weber put it, that the state has the monopoly on the legitimate use of force, This is simply the idea that this state is the ultimate authority in its given territory. And that's exactly what it means here when we're talking about international relations. The idea is that there's sort of the central organizing principle of how we are responding to the world of anarchy is that within each state's territory, they should be the ultimate sovereign. They are the ultimate decider. They are the ultimate authority. And so the Mexican government, from the perspective of our current international norms and institutions, has no ability or right to influence policy in the United States or in other countries, like Belize. The United States, likewise, does not have the ability to make rules or impact actors in Mexico. Now, of course, there are other ways of doing this, but the idea of sovereignty is that the ultimate authority over any given territory lies within that state's government. And so when we talk about influencing difficult states from the perspectives of the United States, like Iran and North Korea, we also have to wrestle with this idea that the entire world is very much predicated upon the idea that states have sovereignty to do what they want to do within their own territory. Now, as we see, it gets pretty tricky pretty quickly because what one state does in their own territory may have consequences for neighbors or for the entire world. And so that's where we'll leave it for now. As always, get in touch with any questions, concerns, or comments. Have a wonderful day.